Good morning, friends. This is the Prepared Suburbanite. Hope you're all doing well. This morning, I wanted to get into the dynamics of prepper groups, mutual assistance groups. From what I hear and from what my experience has been, that a group dynamic is going to be very, very important when the S hits the fan. So we're going to explore prepper group dynamics in this video, so stay tuned. I recently caught a video from Pastor Joe Fox on the Viking Preparedness YouTube channel, and he brought up some very interesting thoughts about prepper groups, what makes them work and what makes them not work. And basically, what he was talking about is the group's purpose. And the way he defined it, and I'll put a link to his video down below here, but he asked the question, what do you care about and what's most important to you? And then he went on to get into some more detail about what are must-haves and what are nice-to-haves, what are will-not-tolerates, and what are items that are negotiable. Bottom line is, in his message in his video, was to make sure that you truly understand the dynamic of the group, what the purpose of that group really is for. Now, a lot of prepper groups and a lot of mutual assistance groups will have an overarching theme that's something like this: to ensure the survival of the community, to ensure the survival of the group. And that's kind of sounds like what you want to get involved in. But when you really come to think of it, and you really get pressured for having to make life and death decisions, what's really the purpose of that group? Is it to keep the group alive? Will you sacrifice your family, your wife, your kids for the betterment of that particular group? Or is it more realistic to actually define the purpose of that prepper group or mutual assistance group as being to assist me and my family in survival? You kind of get the difference there. Is the group dynamic really more important than the individual dynamic? And what's your real purpose of being there? I urge you to go to Viking Preparedness YouTube channel and listen to Pastor Joe Fox talk about his thoughts on this particular subject. As we move along, and what Pastor Joe Fox did was instill some thinking in my head about the importance of prepper groups and why it's important to have them and why it's important to truly understand how a prepper group really is designed to function and function for you. I've got a lot of experience dealing with groups and group dynamics. I was a financial executive during my career and led a number of project teams, was involved in a professional organization. I was statewide president of the Professional Association here in North Carolina. And that professional organization is a volunteer group. And I really think that a volunteer group fits that same definition in the same venue as a prepper group does. Given that a prepper group is purely voluntary, You're not getting paid. There isn't any real strict rules. You haven't enlisted like you would if you went into the armed services. So you're dealing with volunteers, and you're dealing with a voluntary mindset. After watching Pastor Joe Fox's presentation and video on his Viking Preparedness YouTube channel, I happened to catch on the History Channel a documentary type show hosted by Morgan Freeman called Through the Wormhole. And the episode that I caught was called What Makes a Terrorist? Very interesting, because you want to talk about group dynamics. We can talk about Al-Qaeda, we can talk about ISIS, and what they do as a group. Questions that he posed in that documentary are questions like this. What makes a terrorist target the lives of innocent civilians, and why are they willing to blow themselves up for their cause? Well, he answers it by saying there's truly a close group dynamic. There's an incredible bond that allows that group to take risks for the group, make sacrifices for the group, that allows their own families to suffer for the benefit of that group, and to do anything, including blowing themselves up for the betterment of that group. The terrorist view of the group supersedes his view and importance of himself. They are completely fused. It's sacred. It's religious. It's single-minded. Then he goes into and explore a little bit more. Is it truly possible to dehumanize others? Well, think about what Al-Qaeda and ISIS have done to dehumanize others. Just think back, the beheadings, the putting people in cages and drowning them. Yeah, it's possible to dehumanize others. They did a couple of experiments where they took groups that were randomly selected and separated them into two teams, maybe 4 people on each team, gave one group a blue t-shirt and the other group a red t-shirt, and started asking a series of questions of them. First, to extract a sense of empathy from the individual groups. So they'd read a question or read a statement like, Mary fell down the steps and skinned her knee. And the group was to give a thumbs up if they empathized with that person, or a thumbs down if they really didn't care and it didn't matter to them. So when they read a statement like, Mary fell down the steps and skinned her knee, both groups, the blue t-shirts and the red t-shirts, everybody empathized with Mary's plight. Well, then the moderator changed the group, changed the question just slightly, and then it went like this. Jim sat down on a park bench and sat in some gum. Jim is a member of the blue team. So they asked the blue team, what do you think? Everybody on the blue team, thumbs up. Then they asked the red team. Everybody on the red team, serves them right, that kind of a thing. So there was an immediate group identification from this group of people that had only been together for just a few minutes that began to dehumanize people. I've seen it in every walk of life, every situation that I've been in. In the work environment, my department's better than your department. If that department has a bad day, well, it serves them right. That's the kind of mentality that you get into, because the human psyche is programmed to dehumanize the opposite group, the competitor group. And competition, I think, is the key term in there. There's conflict that's involved. There's stereotyping that gets involved. There's competition, and especially competition for resources. Oh, resources like food and water, ammunition, money, bartered items, stockpiled inventories. Yeah, there can be a ton of competition when the S hits the fan and you're involved in a prepper group or a mutual assistance group or a family group, and you're competing for extraordinarily important and vital resources. Competing groups, competing for resources, whether it be material resources or psychological resources such as power and control, that's where I think group dynamics really begin to be an important study. Take, for example, how we, as human beings living in this country, currently, in our current political environment, the differences in the groups, when you define the groups as Republicans and Democrats, liberals and conservatives, blacks and whites, rich and poor, East versus West, Yankees and the Red Sox, but most important, self and group. So if you look back, and if you've been involved in a prepper group or a mutual assistance group that turned out to be somewhat unsuccessful, I know I have. I belong to a prepper group right here in town, took on a small leadership role in that group, was active in it for about 18 months or so. And I went with the idea and with a motivation that I wanted to learn more about prepping, what you need for your bug out bags, how to sharpen a knife, maybe a few extra bushcraft skills here and there, and to meet some folks that shared the same need for knowledge and the same need for survivalism if the S hits the fan. So that's my mindset. I go to the group meetings, and at first the group meetings were fairly innocuous. There were some good topics that were discussed. We talked about knives, we talked about ham radio communication, we'd have speakers come in, experts in those fields, and give a presentation on things. And after a while, I think at the peak of the group when I was involved, there may have been 15 or 18 people that would attend any particular meeting, and they met once a month on a Saturday at a local state park. And we'd take over a little pavilion there, and we'd get together for a couple, 3 hours on a Saturday afternoon and go through this group dynamic. Well, after a while, the membership and the attendance started falling off. And I couldn't quite put my finger on what was happening. But I began losing interest in the group as there was less and less group cohesion, group dynamic. The leader of the group bent over backwards to try to keep the group together. He appealed, he called people on the phone, made sure that they knew that the meetings were scheduled and where they were going to be and what time, and urged them to come. But still, the attendance kept dropping off until we reached a point where the group just kind of fizzled away and nobody came anymore. So what really happened there? Did the group have a defined mission, a defined goal that was mutually accepted, negotiated, and agreed upon by all the members? No, it didn't. It was a prepper group. We get together on Saturday afternoons once a month to discuss prepping. And that was the whole group goal, to discuss it. Now, each individual that attended those meetings had a goal in mind, had a need to be fulfilled in mind, but that was never really brought into the discussion about what the group dynamic needed to be, what the goals and objectives of the group had to be, and how to measure goal attainment. How did we do? Did we survive? Did we succeed? Those are the kinds of things that a lot of prepper groups, a lot of volunteer groups, a lot of work teams that you may be involved in, that's where they really do fall apart. That the individuals come with a predetermined set of expectations and a goal that they need to be fulfilled. And if the group doesn't absorb that and negotiate it and reach conclusions based on mutual agreement and cohesion, that group's not going to succeed for very long. It's going to fall apart. Now, contrast that with what goes on in a terrorist group like ISIS or Al-Qaeda, or even these little individual terror cells that are around that we hear about that were involved in the Paris attacks and then the follow-up in the Brussels attack. Those groups were extraordinarily cohesive. They survived through all kinds of stuff. That group was nearly decimated after the Paris attack and reformed, rededicated itself to the Brussels attack and pulled that off and really made a name for themselves. But they were willing to sacrifice everything. Themselves, their families, you name it, they sacrificed it for the betterment of that group. So I believe that in an SHTF type situation, that lone wolves probably aren't going to do all that well. Groups are there because they can be diverse with a common purpose. So here's some of the characteristics based on my research of group dynamics. There's interaction, verbal and nonverbal, relationship and task interactions. There are goals, well-defined goals. Those goals are generated, they're chosen, they're negotiated, and they're executed. They have values, guiding principles, rallying points for that group that are mutually agreed upon. There's an interdependence, and that's the state of being dependent on other people, where one's outcomes, actions, thoughts, feelings, and experiences are determined in whole or in part by others. So that interdependence becomes a critical factor, especially in a prepper group, in a mutual assistance group. There is structure in a group. There are norms, rules, relations, roles and responsibilities that get defined as the group matures. There's unity, where the group dynamic is greater than the sum of its parts. There's positive distinction, individual mobility within the group. There's social creativity, where you're allowed to be creative within the group. And there's internal competition for increasing roles and responsibilities. And there's finally a social identity. There's expectations with reinforcement, and there's cohesion within that group. Now, if you're of a mindset to start a prepper group or get involved in a prepper group or mutual assistance group, keep these things in mind, because I think these are very, very important. And when you talk about the goals and the missions of individual prepper groups, Think back to what Pastor Joe Fox illustrated in his video. Extraordinarily good dynamic there, that the group survival may not be your number one priority. Your own personal survival is your number one priority. Your family's survival could be your number one priority, and the group priorities for survival come second, unless you're part of a terrorist cell. So in a prepper group or mutual assistance group, here are some of the things to consider. Beyond the characteristics that we just reviewed, there's recruitment. Now, how do you recruit? Well, generally it's a closed group. There are connections. People know each other. People went to school with each other. People work in the same work environment. So they know each other and they bring like-minded people into a group. There's also continuing reinforcement with a renewal, like dues, or an annual recommitment to the group. There's group development, integration, common goals, rules for conflict and conflict resolution, and status. Defined roles and responsibility, rankings. There's performance measures. Well, if you've got a goal, how do you know you're achieving the goal unless you've got a way to measure whether you're successful in attaining those goals? A lot of groups do that kind of a thing with feedback surveys. They do it to get that kind of feedback. Did this presentation on knife sharpening really meet your expectations? Did you learn what you came to learn? Those are the kinds of questions that in a measuring performance specter, you've got to take into consideration. So what happens to a group when a lot of the expectations don't get met? Well, the group begins to disperse. And I found that to be true in the prepper group that I was involved in. People just stopped kind of coming to the meetings, and it went from 15 or 18 people that would come to a meeting down to 10 or 11, and then down to 5 or 6, and then there was just 2 or 3, and then the group dispersed. Well, what caused it? Well, there was a malfunction somewhere. A lack of compliance. Could be a leadership failure. Could be that they actually grew too large. That there was a lack of cohesion. So all those factors can lead to a group's dispersion. And then what happens? Well, there can be a transformation where you take the core remnants of that group and rebuild it. You reorganize, redefine the goals, redefine the purposes. That's what happened to the terrorist cell in Paris. After they did their nastiness in Paris, they regrouped, re-recruited, built their strength, put a new strategy into place, and were successful in carrying out the attack in Brussels. So it does work. I found that in the prepper group that I was involved in, that there were certain individuals that really felt strongly about that prepper group, that they got together and have reorganized now. Basically the same kind of a format, a little bit more well-defined, and they began meeting here just a few months ago on a regular basis. The dynamic, I understand, is entirely different. I'm going to try to get in the next couple of weeks to their next meeting and see what the dynamics really turned out to be and see how much they've changed, see what their objectives are, see what their goals are, and make sure that my goals and objectives for my survival match that group's dynamics. So in conclusion, I don't believe a lone wolf is going to be able to survive after the S hits the fan, unless that individual is totally skilled in every discipline. A group, whether it's a prepper group, a survival group, a mutual assistance group, has diversity. That means you're going to have folks that understand carpentry and can work with it, and that are experts in carpentry or plumbing or electrical work. Folks that are experts in gardening and experts in firearms, those that have experience in the military, that understand tactics and strategies for defense and offense, even if you need it. I don't believe that there's a single individual that has that level of expertise in all the necessary skills that are going to be required to survive and thrive after the S hits the fan. So as you're thinking about either getting involved in a prepper group, mutual assistance group, or whether you want to start your own, keep some of these thoughts in mind, because you're not going to be able to pull it off by yourself. Having a group that is cohesive, that shares a common goal, that understands individual needs and requirements, that works well together as a team, that has a good structure, that works for you, that's going to be important. This is the Prepared Suburbanite reminding you to be prepared always. Out for now.